Take your things and get out of this house before I have them removed for you." Honoria Strand, 63-year-old mother of Ronan and reigning figure of the Strand family's hospitality empire, reached into the open suitcase on the guest room floor and pulled out a cream-colored dress. She threw it across the room. The fabric struck Larkin's shoulder and fell in a heap beside her feet. Larkin Hale Strand, 35-year-old wife of Ronan, did not step back. She stood near the window of Belmont House, the Strand family's private coastal estate, and watched Honoria reach into the suitcase again. Carver Strand, 66-year-old founder and public chairman of Strand Hospitality Group, stood near the doorway with his arms folded. He had not touched anything himself. He did not need to. Honoria was doing exactly what he had instructed. Ronan Strand, 39-year-old husband of Larkin and executive vice president of corporate development at Strand Hospitality Group, stood just inside the room with Farah Keld, 30-year-old director of brand experience at Strand and his mistress of nearly 2 years, positioned a half-step behind his right shoulder. Farah's expression carried a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of someone who had already decided how this scene would end. Honoria lifted a folded blouse by the collar and flung it. It caught Larkin across the cheek, the button at the cuff, striking the side of her face before the fabric dropped. The room went quiet. Larkin pressed 2 fingers against her cheekbone. The skin was warm. She looked at her husband. Ronan looked at the floor. "Are you going to say something?" she asked. He did not answer. Carver's attorney, a thin man named Wickerell, 51, opened a leather portfolio on the writing desk and placed 2 documents side by side, a divorce petition, a proposed settlement. "These papers protect inherited property on both sides," Wick said. "Ronan intends to file." Larkin's eyes moved from the documents to her husband's face. Ronan picked up the pen without looking at her and signed both pages. Farah reached up and straightened the collar of his jacket while the ink was still drying. The Strand family believed they were removing a woman who had come into their world with nothing. They believed the quiet, simply dressed wife who drove her own car and declined to wear the jewelry Honoria had offered on their first Christmas together was someone who could be dismissed like a guest who had overstayed a reservation. They did not know that Larkin was the only daughter of Thaddeus Hale, 72 years old at the time of his death, a private equity investor who had spent 4 decades quietly acquiring hospitality assets, hotel infrastructure, and real estate across the eastern seaboard. They did not know she was the sole beneficiary of the Hale Private Trust, or that the trust controlled Meridian Holdings, the investment company that had purchased 76% of Strand Hospitality Group's voting shares 22 months ago, when the company could no longer service its debt. By signing the divorce petition and a proposed settlement protecting each spouse's separate and inherited property, Ronan believed he had freed himself from a woman who would slow him down. Instead, he had separated himself from the person whose hidden fortune had been keeping his family's company from collapse. He would not understand what he had done until the morning the corporate jet doors would not open for him. 8 years earlier, Larkin had not been looking for a reason to trust anyone when she met Ronan Strand. Her father had sent her to a hospitality industry conference in Charleston, not as Thaddeus Hale's daughter, but in her own capacity as a portfolio analyst for the Hale Trust. The surname on her badge read simply Hale, the same name she had used throughout school and throughout her professional life. Almost no one connected her to her father's empire. That was exactly how Thaddeus had designed it. She had been crossing the lobby of the conference hotel when she witnessed the incident that changed everything. A young bellman had been struggling with a luggage cart that caught a wheel on the marble threshold. One of the guests, a man in an expensive suit who clearly considered his time more valuable than anyone else's, had stepped around the bellman and then, when the cart's handle glanced against his sleeve, turned and delivered a cutting public reprimand loud enough for a dozen bystanders to hear. The bellman said nothing. He bent to retrieve a fallen bag and kept his head down. Then Ronan crossed the lobby. He crouched beside the bellman, lifted 2 of the fallen bags, and set them back on the cart without making a performance of it. He said something quietly to the young man that Larkin couldn't hear. The bellman straightened and managed something close to a smile. Then Ronan turned to the guest and said, with a voice that carried no anger and required none, he was doing his job. "You made it harder. That's the only thing worth commenting on here." The guest walked away without responding. Ronan had not known Larkin was watching. He had not known she was anyone who mattered in any financial or professional sense. He had simply been kind in a room where kindness cost him nothing and required everything. That was why she had married him. Her father had warned her about that kind of hope. Money makes people perform generosity when they think it's being graded, he had told her once, standing in the doorway of a conference room she'd not been supposed to enter. The only character worth believing is the character you catch when no one's watching. Ronan, that afternoon in Charleston, had been caught when no one was watching. 22 months ago, the call had come at 2 in the morning. Ronan had come home late from an emergency board session, found Larkin still awake at the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold beside her. He sat down across from her without removing his jacket. His face looked older than she had ever seen it. "The hotel chain is in trouble," he said. "Not the kind of trouble that fixes itself." He explained it in pieces. A series of leveraged acquisitions during an expansion period had left Strand Hospitality Group carrying more debt than the portfolio could reasonably service. 2 anchor properties had underperformed. A refinancing agreement had collapsed. Payroll for the following month was uncertain. The company's pension obligations were at risk. If restructuring failed, the brand her father-in-law had spent 30 years building would be placed in receivership. "My father will never survive watching it go under," Ronan said. "He built this from a single property in Savannah." He did not cry the way some people cry. He sat very still and pressed his knuckles against his mouth, and that stillness was somehow worse. Larkin held his hand until he fell asleep on the couch. Then she went to her office and called Isolde Crane, 45, her personal attorney and one of 3 people outside the trust's administrators who knew the full scope of the Hale estate. Before sunrise, Larkin authorized Meridian Holdings to begin the process of acquiring a controlling position in Strand Hospitality Group's debt and equity structure. She protected Strand's supply contracts. Hotels have infrastructure and vendor chains as fragile as any industry. She secured the pension obligations. She preserved the employment of every housekeeper, front desk, clerk, concierge, and kitchen worker across 18 properties. She allowed Carver to retain his public chairmanship during a transitional period so that lenders, guests, and industry partners would not panic. She did it because thousands of people's jobs depended on the company surviving. She did it because the man sleeping on her couch had once stopped a stranger from humiliating a bellman. She did not tell him. She was not ready for the conversation that would change every question he would ever ask about their marriage. Ronan woke the next morning to news that an institutional investment group called Meridian Holdings had quietly stepped in with an emergency capital commitment. He called it extraordinary timing. He called it a stroke of luck. His wife sat across the table and poured his coffee and did not correct him. The first visible sign that something was wrong appeared 11 months ago at a Strand Hospitality Group gala in Atlanta. Larkin had been seated at the main table beside Ronan for every gala after their wedding. At that evening's event, she arrived to find Farah Keld occupying the chair next to her husband. It could have been a protocol decision. It could have been Farah's role overseeing that evening's brand campaign. Larkin told herself both things were possible. Then she noticed the travel records. She was not supposed to see them. Isolde had been requesting internal documents as part of a routine trust portfolio review. Meridian Holdings was entitled to certain operational records under the terms of the rescue agreement, and a travel manifest had been attached to the wrong file. Ronan's name appeared 17 times over the past 8 months. Farah's name appeared beside his on 12 of those records. The destinations included properties where Ronan had no formal business scheduled. Beneath the manifests was a hotel folio from a trip to the coast, a suite booked under Strand Corporate Travel. 2 names on the registration. Larkin set the document down on her desk and sat with it for a long time. She told herself it might have an innocent explanation. Then she saw the necklace. 4 months before the Atlanta gala, Ronan had asked Larkin to help him choose a piece of jewelry as a retirement gift for a longtime female board member. Someone with simple taste, he said. Someone who wouldn't want anything too large or too obvious. Larkin had suggested a thin gold chain with a small oval pendant, antique gold, slightly matte, elegant without drawing attention. She had selected the exact piece at a jeweler 2 blocks from their apartment. At the Atlanta gala, under the chandeliers of the ballroom, Farah Keld lifted her champagne glass and the necklace caught the light. Larkin crossed the room without fully knowing she intended to. She found an excuse to stand near Farah and managed to read the engraving on the back of the pendant. For F, after Belmont. She walked back to her table. She sat down. She placed her napkin in her lap and picked up her fork and did not move for a moment she could not measure. After Belmont. Ronan had proposed to Larkin on the deck of the family's coastal estate. Belmont House, 7 years ago. Now he had used the same place as a reference point in a message to another woman, as if Belmont were not where their marriage had begun, but where something else entirely had been promised. Larkin excused herself before dessert. In the car, she told Rue, 28-year-old personal assistant and the only member of her small staff who understood the full weight of what her employer carried, that she would attend the family weekend at Belmont after all. "I thought you'd decided against it," Rue said. "I changed my mind," Larkin said. "I need to hear what he chooses to say when no one else is making the choice for him." Belmont House looked the way it always looked in early autumn, the kind of beautiful that requires significant money to maintain and even more effort to pretend is effortless. Larkin had arrived with one small bag and one intention: to sit across from her husband, without Farah and without his parents in the room, and ask him a direct question. She had not decided what she would do with the answer. That intention lasted until she reached the main hallway and found the weekend's room assignments posted inside the foyer. She had been placed in a secondary guest room at the far end of the east wing. Farah had been assigned the room beside Ronan's. Larkin stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to find her husband. She found him on the private terrace off the main sitting room. Alone, she told him about the necklace, about the hotel folio, about the 12 travel manifests. He did not deny any of it. He said their marriage had grown too quiet. He said Larkin was never fully present. He said Farah understood the pressures he was under in a way that Larkin, who he believed lived a comfortable and undemanding life on the margins of his career, never had. "You supported me," he said, "but that's not the same as standing beside me." Those words settled into her like something cold and permanent. She remembered sitting across from him at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, while he described a company in freefall. She remembered how still he had been. She remembered going to her office and making a call that committed more than she had ever committed to anything in her life. She did not tell him, not yet. Honoria appeared before she could decide. Then Carver, then Wickerell with his leather portfolio, then Farah, stepping carefully into the room as though she'd been waiting in the hallway for her cue. The rest moved quickly, Honoria going through the suitcase, the dress landing on the floor, the blouse catching Larkin's cheek, Ronan watching without a word that mattered, the pen moving across both documents. When it was over, Larkin collected what remained of her belongings. Alma, the housekeeper who had worked Belmont's East Wing for 19 years and had always treated Larkin with the same quiet respect she gave no one else in the family, helped fold what Honoria had scattered. Alma's hands were not entirely steady. "You don't have to do that," Larkin said. "I want to," Alma said. Rue was waiting at the service entrance with the car. She did not say anything when Larkin got in. She simply drove. Isolde was already at the apartment when Larkin arrived. She took one look at the faint red mark along Larkin's cheekbone and went very still. "Tell me what happened," she said. Larkin told her. When she finished, Isolde set down her pen and said, "I can file an emergency preservation notice for every piece of footage and financial record connected to Belmont and Strand Hospitality before midnight." "I know you can." "Larkin, I'm not protecting them anymore." She said it without volume, without performance. "But I won't use the company as a weapon against them for what they did to me. The investigation has to follow what they did to the company. Let the evidence decide everything else." Isolde studied her for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. Later that night, a message arrived from Dashiell Pruett, 49-year-old general manager of Belmont House, who had overseen the estate's operations for 12 years. Before Carver could request a deletion, Dashiell had preserved the full security footage from the guest wing and the main terrace and sent a copy to outside counsel. Alma had agreed to give a written statement. Larkin read the message twice. Then she set her phone down and pressed her palms flat against the table. She sat on the floor beside her chair and allowed herself to grieve for an hour. She was not mourning the estate. She was not mourning Honoria's opinion of her, or the seat at the family table, or the accumulated small indignities of 8 years of being looked at and found lacking. She was mourning the man who had crouched in a hotel lobby in Charleston and handed a bellman back his dignity without asking for anything in return. That man had been real. She had not invented him, and that was the part that would take the longest to set down. The audit had been underway for 2 weeks before the independent committee presented its full findings. What they found was methodical and damaging. Carver had classified a complete renovation of Belmont House's East Wing imported stone, custom millwork, a climate-controlled wine room, and a new terrace heating system as executive hospitality improvement costs and charged it to Strand Hospitality Group's facilities budget. He had used company guarantees, requiring approval he never sought, to service personal debt connected to the estate. He had requisitioned corporate staff and transportation for private family events, and directed employees to alter the records afterward. Ronan's records were no cleaner. 14 trips with Farah had been approved as business development travel. Company resources had been used to arrange private events and personal hotel stays. A senior finance officer had flagged certain expense categories 6 months earlier. Ronan had ignored the warning and instructed the officer to reclassify the items. Farah had submitted the falsified records herself. Jewelry purchases and private bookings appeared in the brand experience budget with altered descriptions. When the committee recovered original drafts from archived files, the actual descriptions were plainly personal in nature. The communications between Ronan and his father were the most damaging of all. In one exchange 3 months before the Belmont weekend, Carver had written, "Once Ronan is chairman, we can clean all of this up. Until then, keep the numbers tidy enough that Meridian doesn't ask questions." They had never asked the one question that would have told them everything. They had never asked who ran Meridian. At Belmont, the family did not know the file existed. The evening after Larkin's departure, Honoria hosted a dinner in the main dining room. Farah sat in the chair that had been Larkin's. Carver spoke about the investor summit, 3 days away, aboard the Strand corporate jet. He talked about the board falling in line, about institutional investors respecting families whose names were on the buildings. Ronan raised his glass. No one at the table opened the compliance summary that had arrived by secure message that afternoon. They assumed it was routine correspondence. None of them had ever understood that when Meridian went quiet, it was not because they were satisfied. It was because the people running Meridian were paying close attention. The morning of the investor summit, Ronan arrived at the private terminal in the navy blazer he wore to every presentation that mattered to him. Carver was already at the gate, phone raised, speaking in the tone he used when he expected everyone within earshot to understand who he was. Honoria stood beside 3 matching pieces of luggage. Farah arrived in ivory and carried the presentation notes. Ronan pressed his executive access card against the reader. The light turned red. He wiped the card and tried again. Red. Carver turned. "What's the problem?" "The reader," Ronan said. He pressed it a 3rd time. The tone that followed was not a malfunction sound, it was a denial sound. He knew the difference. Brea Lund, 44-year-old terminal supervisor with 2 decades at Strand Aviation Services, remained behind the security glass. She was aware of who these people were. She was also aware of the board resolution transmitted to all terminal supervisors before 6 o'clock that morning. "I can't authorize entry," she said. Carver approached the glass. "I built this company. Your discretionary travel authorization was suspended at midnight, sir. I have written instructions from the independent board. I am the board." "As of last night," Brea said, "you are not." Carver struck the glass with the flat of his hand. Several ground crew members stopped moving. The stairs of the corporate jet remained folded. The cabin door stayed closed. It was Farah who first noticed the vehicles entering through the authorized gate. 3 black cars moving in formation. She recognized Isolde Crane stepping out of the second. She did not recognize the woman who emerged from the third. Then the woman turned. Farah's hand tightened on the presentation folder. Ronan looked toward the hangar. The large doors had opened. Morning light swept across polished concrete. A woman walked forward from the interior, her team behind her, her pace unhurried. He recognized her coat before he recognized her face. He recognized the way she moved before he accepted what it meant. Larkin crossed the tarmac. Prentice Soul, 54-year-old lead independent director of Strand Hospitality Group and Meridian Holdings board representative, stepped forward when the 2 groups converged. "This is Larkin Hale Strand," he said, "sole beneficiary of the Hale Private Trust and controlling owner of Meridian Holdings, which holds 76% of Strand Hospitality Group's voting shares." The silence on the tarmac was absolute. Carver laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound. "Her father left her some fund investments," Ronan told us. Larkin spoke for the first time. "Ronan knew my father left me a trust. He decided what it contained without asking." Carver worked through the name, Hale. He had encountered that name before in a financing proposal routed through his attorney's desk. Years before Strand's difficulties began, he had not been able to get a meeting. Thaddeus Hale's daughter, he said. It was not a question. Yes. Prentice opened the board resolution. 22 months ago, when Strand Hospitality Group could no longer service its debt, Meridian Holdings had provided the capital that preserved the company. The rescue agreement had allowed Carver to remain public chairman through a transitional period. That period had ended at midnight. Ronan stared at his wife. He thought about the 2 o'clock morning at the kitchen table. The next day's news about a capital commitment from an institution no one had heard of. The timing he had called a stroke of luck. He thought about every time he had told people his wife was comfortable staying in the background. He thought about what the background had actually contained. "The night you came home and told me the company was finished," Larkin said before he could speak. "I authorized the first transfer before you woke up." He closed his eyes. The committee's outside counsel read Carver his formal notice. His protected chairmanship was ended. His discretionary access to company accounts, aircraft, and staff was revoked. Civil proceedings to recover funds improperly charged to company accounts were beginning. Carver did not take the document. Prentice placed it on top of his luggage. Ronan's suspension was read next. Travel rights revoked, executive access suspended. The CEO announcement he had been preparing for weeks was tabled indefinitely. Farah's termination had taken effect at midnight. Her company devices had been preserved. The records recovered from them were significant. Later, inside a private room in the terminal, Larkin sat across from her husband. He looked like a man who had been standing in the same place for a long time and had only just noticed the ground had changed beneath him. "You could have told me," he said. "I told you my father left me hospitality and real estate investments inside a private trust," she said. "You heard what you expected to hear." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "If I had known what you were, everything would have been different." "That's the problem," she said. "You would have treated me differently once you knew what I was worth. But you should have treated me the same regardless." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him without flinching. "You're apologizing because you understand my ownership now. That is not the same thing as understanding my value." He had no answer for that. She stood. "The board will handle the investigation. I've disclosed our marriage and recused myself from anything related to your employment. What happens next will be decided by evidence, not by me." At the door, she paused. "The bellman in Charleston," she said. "That was real. I never stopped believing it was real. But one moment of genuine kindness doesn't settle what happened over 8 years. I needed you to choose me when you believed I had nothing to offer. You answered that question at Belmont." She left. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They arrive the way things do when records are thorough and time is patient. One finding at a time, one account at a time, one name at a time. Farah's claim that she had only followed Ronan's directives collapsed when investigators produced expense descriptions written in her handwriting. Her professional reputation followed her termination. Carver's personal guarantees, which had tied Strand Company assets to Belmont's renovation debt, gave lenders leverage he had never anticipated. The estate entered a restructuring review. Investment properties were sold to meet obligations. Honoria watched workers box up the rooms of Belmont House on a grey Wednesday morning. She stood in the doorway of the terrace where she had thrown Larkin's clothing over the railing. Larkin was not there. She had not sent anyone to watch. Ronan left the company residence and took a smaller apartment across the city. The professional relationships that had formed around his name quietly stepped back when the audit became public. Farah stopped returning his calls the week his suspension became permanent termination. He was not destroyed, he was diminished, and he would carry with him the knowledge that he had abandoned the person most responsible for his survival in order to impress people who disappeared, the moment he could no longer reward them. Larkin did not appoint herself chief executive of Strand Hospitality Group. She asked Orson Webb, 51-year-old chief operating officer who had spent 2 decades protecting the property's operational integrity from the Strand family's excesses, to take the interim role. He accepted. She remained CEO of Meridian Holdings and worked with Prentice to introduce independent expense reviews, clear policies on corporate travel, and protected reporting channels for employees who had previously been afraid to speak. She restored full pension contributions. She implemented a profit-sharing structure so that the people who kept the properties running could benefit when the company performed well. She also established a fund for hospitality workers, housekeepers, kitchen staff, bell attendants, front desk employees facing unexpected hardship, She gave it no name attached to the Hale family or the Strand family or herself. It only needed to work. Several months later, she returned to Charleston for an industry conference. She stayed in a mid-range hotel rather than a luxury property. She was traveling alone. In the lobby, she passed a young bell attendant struggling with a cart whose wheel had caught on a threshold seam. She crouched beside him, steadied the cart, and helped lift the corner across the gap. The attendant thanked her. She stood and dusted her hands on her trousers and continued walking. No one in the lobby knew who she was. No one needed to. Her father had told her once that the greatest inheritance he could give her was not the trust or the holdings or the properties or the capital. It was the understanding that dignity does not require an audience. That a woman's worth is not something that gets revealed when the right documents are finally opened. It exists, quietly and completely, whether or not the people in the room have bothered to look.